Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We're in the Calamus section, and we now will meet a very interesting little poem. I hear it was charged against me. Now this title will sound a whole lot like the poem we did earlier when I heard at the close of day. There, the observation was that the comments made about Whitman were in fact positive in that review from that newspaper. Here, we're going to have a little bit more negative kind of assessment. Whitman was aware that he was perceived often as being iconoclastic, that is to say, kind of somehow picking up a big aluminum bat and bashing against sacred institutions and the like. So he's going to try to answer some of that here. But what we love best about this little poem is the way in which we'll watch Whitman do philosophy. He's going to borrow heavily from what we will refer to, of course, today as the Hegelian synthesis, that idea that there is this thesis, there's this opposite antithesis, and then somehow they, through a process called dialectic, they produce this synthesis. We're going to watch Whitman actually play that game right here in this poem, which makes it a fascinating poem. Now, our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt. Everything from inscriptions all the way up and including the last poem that we just did, This Moment, Yearning and Thoughtful. Now let's turn to Norton's really quickly to get a little bit of background information on this one. He says in 1860, the first line of this Calamus number 24 was actually in the present tense. There are no further changes after the poem took its title in 1867. Now, this idea of being charged against me, the poem is to be taken not as a reaction to a specific charge, Norton says, but as the spirited rhetorical challenge of a man whose visionary utterance is not to be confined by the institutional. You will remember that at the very beginning of Song of Myself, he said it's schools and creeds in abeyance. That is to say, what I'm going to have to say is something that's transcendent or somehow beyond anything that's institutionalized. And to that degree, it's fascinating to read a little poem like this. I hear it was charged against me. Let's just enjoy it. I hear it was charged against me that I sought to destroy institutions, but really I am neither for nor against institutions. What indeed have I in common with them, or what with the destruction of them? Only I will establish in the Manhattan and in every city of these states, inland and seaboard, and in the fields and woods, and above every little or large that dents the water, without edifices or rules or trustees or any argument, the institution of the dear love of comrades. Now let's just point out for a moment here the genius of the way that this little poem is constructed. For example, notice all of the use of prepositions. We've talked a lot about how Whitman loves to place within his poems, using prepositions, certain kinds of ideas. And as I mentioned already, we're going to study the use of the Hegelian synthesis, as it will be referred to often. Notice, he begins with, I hear it was charged, as opposed to I hear it is charged. I hear it was charged against me. Notice this idea of I hear. We've seen this a couple of times in Leaves of Grass. Oh, really? I heard this thing. You know, in other words, it's like this idea came to me. I'm just going to try to, respond to it in some way. That I sought to destroy institutions. Well, I mean, the truth is, right, if you go back and you take a look at the opening lines of Song of Myself, passage 1, you'll remember that he says it, right? I'm going to go ahead and try to say some things that will be beyond schools and creeds. That is to say, anything institutions want to have to say. But really, he says, I am neither for nor against institutions. Now, we've seen this in Calamus already several times, where the real versus the contrived, the real and the authentic versus the not so real, not so authentic, the inauthentic. And here he'll make this argument, I'm really not against institutions. But he'll then point out, in parentheses, making us think of our Emily Dickinson, what indeed have I in common with institutions, or what with the destruction of them? Now, it's an interesting rhetorical question, because Whitman had a number of institutions that he had nothing in common with. We think of slavery as one of those, right? I mean, he was fired and had to go down to New Orleans because he was fired for his positions on the abolitionist movement. But Whitman, by and large, had a very interesting dance that was constructed around institutionalism. On the one hand, he recognized he needed to work within systems. As I said, he was a school teacher in previous lectures, but he had problems with school teaching. As I said, he was a journalist, but he had problems with the way the journalistic institution was run. In other words, there's this artistic dance, this tension between, on the one hand, being within institutions, and on the other hand, railing against institutions. Now, where did he learn an idea like this? I think he learned it from Chaucer. And I've said to you a number of times, you can't read Leaves of Grass without a real full understanding of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And I think that, as we say in our lectures on Chaucer at learnstrong.net, Chaucer was constantly at tension between, on the one hand, being a part of the institution, or a product of the institution, on the other hand, critiquing it in some way. He says it, Whitman says it this way: only I will establish, it's an interesting verb, right? I will establish in the Manhattan, we've seen, of course, Manhattan used a few times already now in Leaves of Grass, Whitman, the great poet of Manhattan and New York. And in every city of these states, inland and seaboard. So in other words, I want to be the poet of everybody. And notice again, all of these prepositions: in the fields and the woods, and above every keel, little or large, that dents the water, without edifices or rules or trustees or any argument, right? In other words, I want to construct something that is beyond all of these institutions, namely, of course, the institution of the dear love of comrades. And again, comrades is that key word in our reading of Calamus. Now, notice the genius of the way this works, right? Where, for example, we will have our thesis, that is to say, this charge that was placed against me. We will have its denial, which is its opposite, the antithesis. But then, in Hegelian-like fashion, we'll have some dialectic that will bring the two together. This synthesis will be this new institution, that is to say, this love of comrades, as he will call it. Well, what are we going to say about this poem in terms of 2A and messages? Well, obviously, the artist, the truly great artist, is always going to be the great synthesizer, going to be the great integrator of all of the previous ideas. I mean, we've said this in a number of lectures at learnstrong.net, that when we look at all of our great thinkers, whoever they are, they always have this tendency to be both backwards looking, forwards looking, and bringing those two together to create something in the moment that's often not fully appreciated or understood in the moment. Obviously, we think of Whitman in that regards. At 2B, obviously, the use of these prepositions. And notice how he constructs this poem so that the main idea, what he's really saying, is all the way at the end of the poem. He'll begin with the word only. I will establish, and then he'll give it: in every city, in the fields, above, and edifices or rules, without edifices or rules. And then all of that will lead into this final climactic moment, the institution of the dear love of comrades. Sounding, now to 3A, very much like Socrates in Plato's Apology. Whitman's going to make this argument: how can I be against institutions when I am in fact supporting the great institution of the love of comrades, the love of one's fellow human beings? Of course, at 3A we've mentioned Hegel. I want to mention as well Republic 10, we've mentioned Plato several times now in our little brief lecture here. Republic 10, go back and look at our comments there. Plato was deeply concerned, you can tell, about the role of the artist within society. Why? Because, as Socrates will point out in Republic 10, the artist will be a supporter of the society, but at the same time will also be a critiquer of the society. We think of Jonathan Swift, don't we, here in this regards? And to that degree, his modest proposal. And to that degree, it's always problematic as to what license the community will actually give to the artist. I want to think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s oppressed people respond to oppression in 3 characteristic ways. And he'll talk about acquiescence as not being a useful kind of way. And then, as we said in our lecture on this famous essay, hatred and corroded violence and hatred is not the way. But then he will actually use that term, the Hegelian synthesis, where he will bring the two opposites together to produce nonviolent resistance in that famous essay. And I think in many ways that we'll see the same game being played here. In other words, I'm not for most of the institutions out there, but I am for the institution of the love of comrades. Finally, at 3B, how are we going to own a poem like this? I think it's a good question. Do you think artists are in fact dangerous to institutions and yet at the same time necessary to those institutions, right? And how about this one to own this poem? What has been charged to you in your life that you would consider to be unfair or only partially true? I mean, Whitman will call it, it's kind of only partially accurate that I'm anti-institutionalist or iconoclastic. The reality is I'm all for certain institutions, especially institutions of the love of comrades, but for you is a certain kind of problem like that you have to deal with. I hope that you're being challenged in your study of the Calamus section. Thank you.